So today I will talk you through getting started with PnP PowerShell. So what are the steps to take from installing, and then the most important part to register your application in your Entra ID, which we need to authenticate towards your tenant. So this will be basically in sort of three sections. First of all is the installing section. Then I will go for the app only registration, and the app only and I will reiterate that also during that talk there, but it's about registering an entry in your Entra ID that allows you to authenticate with PnP PowerShell in an unattended manner. So this is designed for you to run scripts, for instance, automated scripts or Azure functions that use PowerShell, or Azure automations, or scheduled scripts, or everywhere where there's no one sitting behind the screen able to enter a username and a password. And then the second way of registration for interactive login, that is a functionality that is used for you sitting behind your computer, opening PowerShell, connecting to a tenant, and do something on that tenant. This is, I would say, the most common scenario actually for many of you that, for instance, are consultants and working with customers. Keep in mind also that the second registration option for interactive login is something we're using a commandlet that is, and I will again reiterate that during that block, but this is a commandlet that is available as of PnP PowerShell 2.10. So that you know that you have the right version of PnP PowerShell installed in order to do this. So the first thing we're going to do is install PnP PowerShell. And PnP PowerShell is available on a service called the PowerShell Gallery. And within PowerShell, you can very easily go and install modules. Think of them as extensions to PowerShell from that PowerShell Gallery. And there's a built-in commandlet for that. And I'm going to run that now. So you say install module. And see, actually, I did it already before. It's in my history. But you type in the name and then the name of the module that you want to install. So in this case, PowerShell. Now, I already have PnP PowerShell installed, so it will give me a notification that it cannot install it. But just for the sake of the demo, I will still press enter. So what it will do is it will go out now to the internet, connect to the PowerShell Gallery, checks out what the last version is of the module, and downloads that one and installs it. Now, if you run this for the first time on your own machine, you might get a notification that you're trying to install something from an untrusted source. That's a built-in security built into PowerShell. And you will have to say like, hey, I'm okay with it, install it. PowerShell Gallery, you can go to www.powershellgallery.com. It's a Microsoft-owned and hosted service. And you can also decide if you want to, and they show you how to do that, or they mention at least how to do that in a message that you received, to trust this gallery. So from the next time you run this commandlet, it will not ask you to, do you really want to install this? Because I already have it installed, I'm running a debug version here. You can actually see that here. I'm running 2.9.8 debug. But if you run an older version, you want to install it side by side, you can do that with the force parameter. But for now, this is just the way forward. Install module PnP PowerShell. So the moment it's installed, the next step, or the second step we basically have to do, is we have to create a registration in our Entra ID or Azure ID. Basically, there's two ways forward. There is the way of doing a registration that you can use in an unattended manner. So those are, for instance, to be used for like Azure functions or Azure automations, or your own scheduled scripts, or everywhere where you do not want to have a pop-up for a username and a password. So everywhere where you do not want to have the second factor challenge popping up, where you have to provide either a code with your phone or whatever technology you're using. So that's the first way of doing it. The other way is by registering an application in your Entra ID for interactive login. So that is where you do provide a username and a password and an optional second factor. What I will demo during this session is a commandlet that is currently available as of version 2.10. So you make sure that you install the latest 2.10. I have a running version of 2.9.8, which is a debug version that is getting ready for 2.10, and this one has the commandlet already installed. So let's first go for the unattended way. So sorry, the app only way, or the way where you can run an unattended script, so without a username password prompt. So for that, to register an application like that, you say register, and you see I did it already before, so we're going to change this one now because it will otherwise give a conflict on my tenant. So we go to version 2. And if we look at the parameters here, you see the application name. That can be any name, something that you recognize in your Entra Id. Then there is a tenant name, which is your current tenant. That can be like company.sharepoint.com, depending a bit on how your tenant is being set up. And then I say interactive. And what does this interactive mean? It means that the moment I press enter now, it will check first if the application is already, if it can register the application. By means of checking if it can authenticate and those kind of things. And if there's already an application with that name there, then it will not be able to register it. But if everything goes okay, it will go through the whole scenario of creating the application, and then also allowing you to provide consent to the application. So we're going to press enter now, and I'll talk you through it. It says no permission specified using default permissions. It's launching a browser right now. You see the little icon pop up there, and there we go. And it wants me to log in to my Entra ID, to my tenant, Azure tenant. So you need an account that has admin rights there. So I'm logging in here. And it says like, successfully acquired a token. You may close this window now. You don't have to close it, but you may. Now, behind the scenes, now it continued the commandlet. It registered the application in the Entra ID. And now it's waiting 30 seconds. And we notice it sometimes takes a bit, and that's why we're waiting 30 seconds here. And then we were launching the consent flow. So it's almost done with that. And after 30 seconds, another window pops up. Here we go. And I log in again with that same ID, or with an ID that has administration rights on the Entra ID. And by default, because I didn't specify any permissions in the commandlet, you can do that, but we didn't do that. So you will get a set of default permissions. And here we have like read and write all groups, all user profiles, sign in and read the user profile. That's a standard one. Have full control of all site collections, have full control of all site collections. One is app only, the other one is delegate. And read and write user profiles. So if I now press accept, you consented successfully, and you can close this browser now. From this moment on, the application has been registered. Now you see a lot of text here on the screen. If I scroll a bit up here, that is basically the certificate in base64 encoded. There's several ways of authenticating now with this certificate, but I'm going to show you the easiest way. And what to keep track of here is this ID and this certificate file. Those are the two keys into the registration. Into the authentication. So I'm going to copy this. And I say connect PnP online. And then it's client ID. That's where the ID is that I just copied here. And certificate. And that is PnP 2024-08-26-2 PFX. I press enter. Now it wants my tenant. I forgot to actually specify that on the command line. You can do a dash tenant and then enter the tenant name. And now I'm authenticated. And you see there was no dialog popping up, no username or password question. I'm authenticated right now towards my tenant. I can say, give me all the lists in this site, and I get all the lists in the site. Now you noticed, or you might realize that when you look at this now, getting hold of the ID of the application and the certificate is enough to get full access to your tenant on a SharePoint level. Now, obviously, that's a bit scary. You want to make sure that certificate is secure, and you want to register a password on that certificate. Now, in order to do that, in the register thing, commandlet, when we register your application, you can provide a password. That's a secure string, so you could even do like read host prompt enter password as secure string. So basically what happens right now is that the moment I press enter, it will first read from the host an input for the password, and that's used as a secure string that is sent into the password parameter. So from this moment on, if I press enter right now, it would register the application. It will have a password. Then in the connect PnP online commandlet, I would also have to do a certificate password. I have to enter that same password here to order to use this certificate. This is app-only access. Now, with the register PnP commandlet, you can also provide other permissions. So if I say SharePoint application permissions, and I can tap through them. So I can set all kinds of specific permissions that are applicable to your application. So we have SharePoint and we have Graph application permissions, but we also have Graph delegate permissions, and we have SharePoint delegate permissions that you can provide. Keep the number of permissions, the amount of permissions, as low as possible. Make sure that you only get the permissions that are used that is needed for you for your specific scenario. So don't give full control to everything. I understand that might be easy, but keep it as slim and as lean as possible. So the second way of authenticating, and this I would say is the more common one, is that you register an Entra Id application for interactive login. And this is the scenario where you want to do some tasks towards your tenant in an interactive manner. So you open PowerShell, you enter a few commandlets, and you do some tasks, create a list, add a field, remove a list item, whatever you want to do. It's an interactive way of doing it. So you expect to authenticate with a username and a password. For that, we have, as of version 2.10 of PnP PowerShell, a new commandlet available. And this commandlet has a very long name, but fortunately, you only have to run it one time per tenant. So the way to go forward there is that you say register, and you see I did it already before, PnP Entra Id app for interactive login. I realize it's a very long name, but as I said, it's only a one time. Application name, so we're going to name it similar to the one that we did in the previous demo. So PnP 2024-0826-03. Obviously, that is something for me to remember. You should give it a more recognizable name, I would say. You provide the tenant that you log into, so companyname.sharepoint.com or however your tenant is set up. And then you provide, excuse me, the interactive switch. That means that you will get a pop-up to authenticate towards your Entra ID. So if I press enter, you see that it wants me to authenticate. I log in. It acquired the token and it says, it already exists. I already created the entry. So it checks if the application exists. So we're going to change this now to 4. And press enter again. It wants me to authenticate again. And now it goes behind the scenes and creates the application in the Entra ID. Now, I personally find the word application a bit confusing because that sort of in my brain means like there is something running on the other side. There is not. It's an application registration. So we're registering only the application in the Entra Id. So that is happening right now. It's almost done. And you notice that the whole flow is identical to the one where we registered an app-only one. So now I'm logging into my Entra Id again. And here you see the permissions that it wants to have. So it wants to read and write to all groups, all user profiles, manage metadata, have full control of all site collections, and read or write user profiles. So these permissions, and that is very important to understand, compared to the previous registration, the first one we did, those are app-only registrations. There's a different permission set. And I would advise you to go to learn.microsoft.com and learn about app-only and delegate permissions because they're different. This commandlet, the Entra Id app for interactive login, only registers delegate permissions. And before I click consent here, I would like to explain what the fundamental difference is here. Because I register something, have full control over all site collections, does not mean that the username and password that you're using, the identity that you're using at a later stage to authenticate with PnP PowerShell will be able to log into all site collections. If your permissions as a person are lower on a certain site collection, you will follow those permissions. You will not get more permissions. That is a difference from app only. So with app only, you have full control over site collections. But if you are with delegate, then the actual permissions you have as an identity, as a person on that site collection, always win over the delegate permissions granted to you through the application. So I click accept, and we have consented successfully. Now, in comparison to the first way of registering the application, where we created a certificate and all these things, that is not needed in this context. We don't need a certificate because we always have to log in with a username password still, with an interactive login. So what I will do now is I will copy this ID. And now from this moment on, I can connect to my tenant with that client ID. You see here also the command line here. URL, the tenant URL, interactive client ID, and then that number. So I say connect PnP online URL interactive client ID, and I paste in that ID that we just created. So keep track of that ID. You can find it later if you want to in the Azure portal, but for now, keep track of it. Press enter. We get a pop-up. You acquired a token, and I'm authenticated. Now, I'm on a Mac. On a Windows machine, this is a tiny bit smoother. You will get a nice dialog pop-up where you see all this work, and then after you're authenticated, the dialog will just disappear, and you are authenticated. So you don't have to close and open a browser. That is also with the registration of the application. That experience is a bit smoother on Windows than it is on Mac OS. Now I'm authenticated, and you see there the prompt has changed. And if I so get PnP list, I get my list. So I have an action, a connection to my tenant currently. If you're a consultant, say you're a consultant, and you're accessing multiple customers from, say you work from home, like I do, and you work with multiple customers, there's two ways forward. One way would to say, listen, I per customer will create an application in the Entra ID of that specific customer with the appropriate access rights. And you will have to keep track over those IDs. That is a way of doing it. Another way of doing it is that you, as a company, and there's a decision you will have to make yourself. As a company, you register your application in your company Azure AD or Entra ID, make that a multi-tenant application. And that basically means that your customers can consent to that multi-tenant application. It's a bit of a more technical story, and I don't want to go into all the details here, and you can find how that works on learn.microsoft.com. But basically what it means that you have a single app registration in your tenant, in your company's tenant. Your customers consented to that one. What happens at the moment they consent is effectively copying that registration into the customer tenant. And from that moment on, you can connect to the customer tenant interactively. So you still need an account on that customer's Entra ID. But you can log interactively towards that customer tenant with the same ID. So you only have to keep track of a single ID. Keep in mind also that changing the permissions on the multi-tenant application in your company app will not automatically update the permissions on the customer side. The customer will have to reconsent to those permissions. It's not pushing down those permissions automatically throughout all your customers. You will have to contact your customer and have to ask them, hey, please reconsent to this application. That is a security measurement. Another thing of doing is say, okay, I do this connect and this client ID, and I don't want to keep track of this client ID. So what you can do is you can create an environment variable. And the environment variable is called Entra Id app ID. So if you set that environment variable to that value of that ID, PnP PowerShell will automatically read that. So if I go to this commandlet again, and I think I still have it in my, it's still in my clipboard. So we can say Entra ID app ID equals. So now I have the, now this is set for this specific session. There are several ways of doing that. You can add it to your profile in PowerShell, or if you're on Windows, set it as a normal environment variable if you go to the control panel and set it as an environment variable. But from this moment on, I registered my Entra ID. So if I now disconnect, so if I do get PnP list, there's no connection anymore. Now I can say connect PnP online. And I say interactive. And I get a pop-up, automatically see there's no client ID that's specified anymore. I authenticate and bang, I'm in there. I'm authenticated towards my tenant. So the commandlet will then automatically recognize that that environment variable is there and will use it for subsequent sessions for you. So that's the easiest way forward, I would say. Instead of you keeping track of this client ID and pasting in that number every time, because it's very easy to forget, obviously. Another way forward could be that if you have multiple customers and you have multiple application IDs for the various customers, consider creating little commandlets in your profile that allows you to connect to those specific customers. Like a little, think of in the old school command line version, like batch files, but create your own commandlets and say, for instance, connect customer X. And that will do connect PnP online URL with the URL interactive dash client ID and then specific client ID. It's a very easy way of keeping track of, instead of doing, it's the same effect. Obviously, it does the client ID behind the scenes, but it just makes your life a tiny bit easier. Again, learn.microsoft.com would be your way forward there and how to create these little commandlets. It doesn't require a single line of code. You do it in PowerShell, obviously. So to end this, let me go and talk you through a bit through the documentation. So at this URL, pnpgithub.io/PowerShell, you find the documentation of PnP PowerShell. So if I open a browser and move the browser in focus here, so you can have a look at it. So pnpgithub.io, and here you find the articles that we wrote and the commandlets. These are the most important things. So if I go to articles, You'll find the installation, authentication, handling credentials if you need those, how to do batching. There's a very powerful function in PnP PowerShell that allows you to batch things towards the graph, and upgrading and configuring all kinds of things. So, like for instance, installation here, what I just described here, install module. And if you want to run a nightly build, you can go here and say, I want the pre-release to be installed. And you get a nightly build, because every night, if there's a change, we make a new version of PnP PowerShell that we release to the PowerShell gallery. So there's a whole lot of articles here for you to read and use and to get up and running with PnP PowerShell. All the commandlets that we have are being described. So that's quite a list. It's over 600 commandlets. So go in here, look up all the various options for you available, etc. So this is an important resource for you to use to understand what you can do with PnP PowerShell, what commandlets are available, what all the parameters are on that specific commandlet. So you can click into a commandlet and go, you see the examples here. And this is also, by the way, reflected within PowerShell. So if you say help, and then the name of the commandlet, you will get the same information shown there. So this is the main website, I think, to keep track of when it comes to PnP PowerShell, with all the information. And we keep this one as updated as possible. That was it for today. Thank you, and I hope you enjoy PnP PowerShell.